My name is James Nicholson, and this is the full presentation for my final project for E90. And it's a presentation of my Team Responsibility Manager application, which is hosted on AWS's serverless application repository. And briefly, what Team Responsibility Manager does is it keeps track of responsibilities that you define in a configuration file that are shared by a team of people, and it maintains the state of who is currently responsible for that responsibility. And on a schedule that you define in the configuration file, it switches the responsibility from one person to the next and sends out notifications via Slack to a team channel, so that everybody knows who's responsible for what on what day. Now, to create an application that can be hosted on the AWS serverless application repository, you can use AWS's serverless application model, which is a specification for defining some templates and configuration files that specify what resources need to be created when someone deploys your application. And the first step for doing that is installing the AWS serverless application model CLI. And you can see here that it's accessed by typing in SAM. And this can be found on AWS's website. And to start off, you would type in SAM init to create your project. And I'm already in my project, so I won't do that. As you can see, I'm in the Team Responsibility Manager directory here. And I will show you what the directory structure looks like. And I will do that by typing in, sorry, not pwd. I will type in this, and you can see here we've got some template files, samconfig, .aws sam. So typing in sam init will create the basic project structure for your serverless application, and then you're going to have to go in and create a template file that will eventually tell AWS CloudFormation which resources to create. I actually did not edit these from iTerm, as you probably wouldn't be surprised. So let's go into VS Code. And we can look at the same directory. And there's a number of different runtimes that you can choose from if you're going to create a serverless application using AWS Lambda. There's other resources you can use to create applications. It doesn't have to be Lambda. That's what I used to create this application. It's a Lambda function that's triggered by an EventBridge event every 15 minutes that checks all the configured responsibilities and sees if they need to rotate, and if so, it rotates them, and then it sort of writes to a state file. So I chose the Python runtime, and there's lots of there's other runtimes you can choose from depending on what you like developing in. So when you do SAM init, it sort of bootstraps the project for you, and it creates this app.py file for you that will run when your Lambda function is created. And actually, before I go into this, I want to go into the template file, which is basically lies at the heart of the AWS serverless application model. And if you're familiar with AWS CloudFormation, which you probably are from this class, this should be familiar to you. But this document basically, which is a YAML file, as I said earlier, defines the resources that need to be created, the the policies that are needed for resources to be accessed. So let me just briefly go over what's in this template file for the Team Responsibility Manager application. So up here we have some metadata about the application, and this is for when you're actually publishing this stack, this serverless application to Amazon's serverless application repository. If you want to publish it and make it available to people to deploy on their infrastructure in AWS, you need this metadata section, which is going to describe the license, the where the source code is, who the author is, which is me in this case, a description, and sort of a name for the project that you'll see when you go into the let's see if we can go back here. And that metadata that you just saw corresponds to the information that you see here when you go into, whoops, when you go into the, when you click on the application that's deployed, you can see here, it has all that information that I typed in there, like the GitHub repository, the name that I chose, and also you'll see down here some application settings. So if I go back here, it has the semantic version. So that's for actually publishing it. Before you publish it, you can actually deploy it to your own AWS infrastructure, your own AWS account without having to publish it and make it available to anyone else. For Team Responsibility Manager, the basic resources are an S3 bucket, which is here, the Lambda function, which is defined here, the events that will trigger the Lambda function, which are conveniently defined inside of the Lambda function, the policies that will be used to access the the S3 bucket that is created and accessed by the Lambda function. So all of these properties are going to be very well documented on AWS's website. So I'm not going to go into all of these, but you can see here that I define my bucket, which is where the config file and the state file are going to be stored for Team Responsibility Manager. And you'll see here, this is my bucket name parameter that I'm referencing here. This allows I can also in this template file you can create parameters that will be used when the application is deployed, and you can reference those parameters in the resources section. And you can see here, that I have my bucket name down here that people can specify the name of the bucket when the application is deployed on their infrastructure. So I've got my bucket, I've got my AWS serverless function, which is the Lambda function. I can define my memory and my, the timeout for the function. And that's pretty much the gist of what's going on here in the template file. And going back to the terminal here, once you've got all of that set up, you would basically come in here, you would build it, which I can actually just do here because that doesn't destroy anything. That's going to, package up and sort of build the, all the files that are kind of defined in your runtime. And you can kind of see what that does here. And then once it's built, then you would run sam deploy, and that's what actually would deploy it to your your own personal, AWS account, and you can see that I'm, defining my profile personal here because I don't want to deploy it to my default account, which is my work account, and I accidentally almost did that. Luckily, I don't actually even have the permissions to deploy to AWS SAM on my work account, so that didn't work. But definitely specify your personal profile if you're going to be using this. And once it's deployed successfully, before you publish it, you can come into AWS and come into, you can go to CloudFormation. And this is where you would, see it show up. If you wanted to sort of, there's various places you could look at the resources that were created, but if you wanted to, look at the stack that was deployed, you could come in here and sort of and look at that, and we'll revisit this a little bit later. And so that would be done with SAM deploy. So now I'd like to just show a bit of the source code for the actual team responsibility manager, application, which is a Python application, and talk about how it works. So at the very bottom of this file, it's only about 150 lines of code. I've got the Lambda handler, and this is what's actually, running. This is the entry point for the Lambda function. And as I said earlier, one of the things that's deployed when the serverless application, is deployed is the event bridge rule, which is going to, basically just create an event in AWS. And this particular event is going to be run on a schedule. You can create lots of different event types in AWS Event Bridge. And this one's going to be run on a schedule that I defined using cron. And I believe actually that is that, yeah, you can see that here in the template. This is the schedule, the cron schedule is going to be used for this event bridge event that I defined here. And as you can see, it's going to be run every 15 minutes, which is fine for this application because it's only the I guess most frequent that a responsibility will rotate is daily. So you can define a time of day that the responsibility will rotate, and that's as sort of frequent as you can get. You can't have a responsibility that's rotating every hour at the moment, but I could do that as an enhancement later if that became something that we were interested in on my team or something. So this is going to get triggered every 15 minutes. It's going to get or create the configuration file, and I have a configuration file template here that's just defined inside of a Python file. The serverless application model and sort of deploying these serverless applications using AWS, this serverless application model that I'm talking about. If you've deployed a Lambda function, you'll probably know this because I think it's similar. It's not always easy to have a local text file that you wanted to read from if you were going to use, like a template file like this. So I actually had to create this as a Python file that defined, a JSON string. So that was kind of a bit of a workaround. But if the config file, doesn't exist or got deleted, for instance, it's going to create it and put it into the bucket that was created during deployment. And then it's going to check if the application is enabled or disabled, which is done from this configuration file. You can see here right at the top, enabled is false by default. So once you deploy it, you're going to have to go in and modify your config.json and re-upload it to S3 in order to actually enable the application to start checking responsibilities. Then from that point, it's going to check if there's a state file. If not, it's going to create one in that same bucket. And as I mentioned earlier, the state file just describes who is responsible for what at that given time. It's going to then read that state file, either the one that it created or the one that already exists. And then basically the heart and soul of the sort of what this whole thing does is it's going to here handle responsibilities. So it's going to look at all the responsibilities and see if they need to get rotated, and if they do rotate, then a Slack notification will be sent out every time a responsibility rotates on the schedule that's defined in this config template, in this config file. So you can see here that, and I'll go into the config file now because I think it'll be useful to just understand the rest of what's going on in the code. That in the config file, you define your local time zone, any Slack channels that you're going to be sending notifications to. You're going to define the people that are on the teams that you're going to reference from responsibilities. And this is all documented in more depth from in the README of the GitHub repository. So I won't go into fine detail here on this. You're going to define the people, you're going to define the teams that are going to be responsible for responsibilities. And then down here in responsibilities, you're going to basically define all of your responsibilities. So I just have a random one here called garbage collector. And the team responsible for this is called my team. And that's the team that's defined right here. That's the unique ID within this configuration file that you're referencing. The rotation for this responsibility is weekly. And it's going to rotate on Monday on the 8th hour of the day. And that's on a 24-hour clock that's relative to your time zone. And when it does, it's going to send a notification to this Slack channel. And I'll show you real quick what those look like. So I just have a test channel set up here called TRM test. And it would say, hey, Jay Nicholson, you're the garbage collector today. Or, hey, Jay Nicholson, you're the paper collector today. And ideally, you would use like a team channel for that so that, the person who's responsible that day would get tagged, and then, the rest of the team knows who's responsible that day. So this is, the rest of the code that kind of handles that responsibility switching, rotating process. A lot of it is checking if files exist on S3 and if, getting or creating them, uploading these files. I try to, sort of, have sort of one task per function here to kind of have a separation of duties in my code. And you can see here, this is my handle responsibilities. So this is going to look at all the responsibilities defined in the config file. It's going to do some, all of this is doing some logging to CloudWatch. And then it's going to run this function, should rotate. And that's basically this function here. That's what's going to check the state file, check the time, check the responsibility, and see, since this function is running every 15 minutes, and if this is a responsibility that's switching at, on the 9th hour of, let's say, Mondays. So if the current time when this runs is let's say it's 9:01, or sorry, no, it only runs on, it runs on the quarter hour of every hour, so 0, 15, 30, 45, and 60. So it's going to run at 9 a.m. It's going to see that it's been at least a week since it last rotated, because that's in the state file. And if it's been longer basically than the rotation frequency, then it's going to rotate. It's going to update the state file, and it's going to send the notification. And feel free to, of course, this is the code is open sourced on GitHub if you want to look into this and sort of see more about how this works. So I would say it took me probably, in terms of total time that it took me to do this, probably 50% was done actually creating the application, and if not more was created figuring out how the serverless application model works and how to deploy and dealing with all of the bugs that kind of took place during building and deploying and publishing. And so that was definitely a learning curve for me. But hopefully, this video and my source code and everything could give you a basis for understanding how that works, and would allow you to, understand some of the concepts and things that you would need to do to maybe, create your own application and deploy it. And I encourage you to find this one and, deploy it on your own AWS account and set it up and configure it with your Slack and use it on your team. Thank you for listening. Hopefully this wasn't too long. And if you want to help me with any enhancements or bug fixes, feel free to submit a PR or message me with any questions. My email address is nicholsonjf@gmail.com. And I would be happy to talk about this with anyone. Thank you.